Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first keynote of SLAS 2026. My name is Jeff Goodwin, and I'm a lecturer in global political economy here at the University of Leeds, and I'm also the co-director of the Centre for Global Development, which is sponsoring the keynote today. Before I go on to introduce our keynote speaker, Anna told me that someone has left their telephone and it's being kept at the...
Yeah, the registration desk.
Yeah, so if you've lost your telephone, anyone, then it's being kept at a registration desk. There's no need to rush out now, right?
It's ringing.
Yeah,
it's ringing.
It's ringing, yeah. And more than that, I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's been involved in organising this conference, particularly Anna Grimaldi and Marcos Frandorfer. who have both put in a tremendous amount of effort in really challenging circumstances to make this a brilliant conference. So thank you particularly to them, but also to everyone, including all of our fantastic volunteers. SLAS conferences have been a huge part of my academic life and have brought me a tremendous amount of joy. So on a personal level, I'm particularly happy to see the conference back at Leeds. And I'm old enough to remember the last time it was here, which I think was about 15 years ago, maybe longer. And we're delighted to have Professor Leslie Wehner with us today to give the keynote. Professor Wehner holds the chair of international relations at the University of Bath, and he has written extensively on Latin American foreign policy and foreign policy more generally, with a particular emphasis in recent years on populism. And today he will talk about far-right foreign policy and global governance from a Latin American perspective, which of course is a very timely and important topic. Professor Wehner will talk for about 35, 40 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end, so please think of questions as the presentation is happening, and I'll happily pass over to Leslie. So thank you very much for being here.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. Well, voy a decir esto en español. Voy a hablar un poco en mi lengua materna. Solamente buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por la invitación. Now I'm going to just switch to this. Today I'm just going to talk about far-right leadership, right? Some will call it populism, far-right populism. I call it far-right populism because there is also populism on the other side. So I'm going to talk about foreign policy. So if there is anything that kind of conceptually you don't understand, please, we'll be happy to clarify. And you're more than happy to, to take questions as they come. So, but also as well, we're going to talk about global governance. And I'm just going to focus on some kind of key cases that I guess you will suspect who these, cases are. But let me start with a broader context. I think you can recognize some of these people, right? Especially perhaps Donald Trump, right? So the point is, and the starting point of this presentation is that the world is experiencing a wave of far-right leadership as the cases of Donald Trump, Viktor Orbán, Giorgia Meloni, Erdoğan demonstrates, right? So these far-right leaders promise to restore what they claim their countries have recently lost, right? Traditional values, order, whatever it means, I don't know, security and economic growth, right? And in doing so, they often target political elites, progressive groups, and they actually present themselves as the true representatives of the people, and also against a corrupt elite, right? That this elite has betrayed the nation. So that's kind of like what they talk about. While these leaders mobilize domestic audiences, they also seek international legitimacy. They adopt a distinctive foreign policy strategy that support their claims. So these international actions are not merely symbolic or driven by short-term gains. They actually, my point here is that they are reshaping the international landscape. They are reshaping key pillars of global governance as well. So this rise of right-wing populism has also become a pressing phenomenon in Latin America, right? So Argentina, in the past Brazil with Bolsonaro, recently Chile with Jose Antonio Cast, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and El Salvador, right? So I will also include United States that is looking in many ways more and more similar to these populist experiences in Latin America. So all these people has made it to power in recent years. And I think most of you would agree that populism has become a global phenomenon because it seems to be everywhere, right? It's also here in this country. So, but it is also international in the sense that populist leaders have been able to shape and reshape the international landscape and also dynamics of international cooperation. So therefore, this presentation focuses on some key dimensions through the populist experience of Latin America. So these are the key kind of overarching questions that I'm going to try to answer through the Latin American cases. So what is populist foreign policy? Can we talk about a populist foreign policy at all? How can we conceptualize this populist foreign policy? And what are the effects of this type of populist foreign policy? And lastly, how are populist leaders remaking patterns of international cooperation, multilateralism, and also global governance? So, in order to understand whether we can talk about a populist foreign policy, we need to understand a bit what populism is, right? So, populism can be conceptualized as a political strategy, or some has conceptualized it as a political strategy, as a discursive practice, as a sin-centered ideology, or as a performative style. All these definitions, and I'm not going to delve deeper into these conceptualizations, but all these definitions are different in many ways, but they actually they have a common denominator. This, right? So the triad of people versus elites and the general will of the people, these are the kind of, the key aspects or the core of these different definitions on populism. It is the populist leader who knows best what the general will of the people is, right? And he represent himself or herself as the true representative of these people, right? They seek to protect, these type of leaders actually in their narrations, they seek to protect the people. But they protect the people against this corrupt elite, right? So there are different notions of elites, it can be many. But in these cases, when we talk about far-right populism, right, most of the elite is incarnated, is part of the state. It's like somehow it's politicians and the bureaucratic elites of the state. So through this triad of people, anti-elite, and general will, the leader positions himself not only domestically, but also internationally. So a different approach to populism and an additional conceptualization is the notion of heartland, right? So, and this term was coined, it comes from geopolitics, the notion of heartland. But it was brought into the populist studies by Paul Taggart, who talks of the people as some sort of derivative consequence of populist leaders' alliance and devotion to the heartland. The people is not, for Paul Taggart, the people is not the unifying aspect of populism. It is this heartland. And this heartland is actually an idealized construction of something that was lost in the past, right? That we lack now, that is gone. And this has to do with this vision of an idealized world that we live in the past when everything was much better, right? Where all these notions of order, stability, they were there. So this vision is articulated retrospectively in relation to a lost and better past. It is this loss of this glorious past of the nation in the present that is now used to actually construct and articulate a political project to view the future, right? towards the future, to achieve a new future. So when we talk about these aspects, these conceptual aspects of the people versus the elite, but also this lost notion, the lost or the lacking of the nation, right? So basically what populist foreign policy is about, at least in terms of a strategic narrative, it has to have these components, in my view, right? So it has to be this kind of, depiction of the world in a Manichaean way, right? The us versus them, right? It's not just about the national elites that have eroded the value of the nation, but it's also as well those global elites that are somewhere, right? Mainly in multilateral institutions for some of these populist leaders. So when we talk about this kind of triad, we start to see that actually the world is depicted in a dyadic way, in a Manichaean way, and we can see that perhaps there is something about that we can call populist foreign policy, right? I think you can imagine now that you can hear some of these leaders, right? When Donald Trump talks about the United Nations, and when we draw from the United Nations, we can see these dynamics and blaming these global elites, these elites that have corrupted the nation. So now, if we talk about that there is a populist foreign policy, I think there is not much contestation that there is populism at the national level, right? So this kind of research agenda comes from Donald Trump. When he was elected the first time, Donald Trump, we started to pay attention to this landscape of cases of populist leaders. And actually, you know this, that Latin America, for good or bad, it is a rich landscape of cases. I mean, some will say that we are experiencing a fourth wave of populism, right? So we have all, to the 30s and 40s with Getulio Vargas and Perón. We also have like the so-called neoliberal populist experience in the 1990s with Menem, with Fujimori. But even we have, perhaps for some, we also have a third wave with Hugo Chavez, and Correa, and so on. But now we are living a different type of populist wave, which is a fourth wave for many, right? So which is more like right-wing experience, right? With the exception of the case of Manuel López Obrador, perhaps, right? If we kind of, consider AMLO as part of this populist wave. But even if we go before the first wave, we have something called, for historians, we call it proto-populism as well, with Hipólito of Yrigoyen. So we have a rich landscape and treasure for theoretical intuition and elaboration when it comes to populist cases. But not many studies have been advanced about the international effects and manifestations of populism. How does the concept of populism interact and becomes valuable when we talk about the international, when we talk about foreign policy? So it is that triad. At least rhetorically, it has to have that component again, right? That dynamic between the people versus the elite. But what else if we really think that there is a populist foreign policy? Some key features of a populist foreign policy has to do with this, right? There are three elements, and how the populist leaders actually play and enact this kind of, populist foreign policy. So one is personalization, right? So the other is politicization and mobilization. So first, as a key feature of populist foreign policy is personalization. And it's not only that these leaders become center stage in foreign policy making, especially in presidential systems, where already all leaders, populists and non-populists, enjoy enough latitude to decide on international matters, right? So that's already kind of the Latin American case. But what I mean here is that they erode the power of the Foreign Affairs Office. For instance, they appoint cronies. I mean, for instance, Bolsonaro appointed his cronies in the Itamaraty or the Foreign Affairs Office, right? Also, Bolsonaro brought most of the foreign policy process, executive decision-making, and the goals, they brought all that to the presidential palace. That's a second kind of strategy. So they kind of, they appoint cronies, they bring a lot of the decision-making in the main issues to the governmental palace, and they also start to sideline the bureaucratic apparatus in foreign policy, right? The experts. And how do they do it? One key measure is that it comes across also in the case of Donald Trump, also in the case of Milei, also in the case of Bolsonaro, is to cut the funding of the Foreign Affairs Office, reduce diplomatic representatives, appoint people in key posts that are loyal to the project at the expense of the so-called specialists in foreign policy. So, and we see this in all the cases, including Donald Trump. In the case of, the State Department, there is a lot of people that has lived and made a career, a diplomatic career, that have left, and that at the expense of appointing people that are not specialists in foreign policy or diplomacy, but they are just loyal to the project. So, at the end, bureaucrats and diplomats are these elites, right? In the narrative of populist leaders, these are part of the elite that we need to remove because they have damaged the country. They have damaged the status and the international standing of the country. So, in other words, it is the leader and his closest group who decide and perform the foreign policy, and the bureaucracy and specialists, they kind of, adopt a rather marginal role in the foreign policy making process. Basically, they execute orders that are made by a small group of loyal followers and the leader. So, the second key characteristic of a populist foreign policy, it is politicization, right? And this is key in a populist foreign policy. What I mean by this is that populist leaders depict the international as an extension of the domestic arena. And it might sound quite intuitive and quite obvious, but when we started to do research on this, it was not that obvious, right? We didn't see that actually foreign policy has never been an issue area that wins elections for anyone. So all candidates, they tend to have a program on foreign policy, but they don't promote it during the campaign trail. But now we see something different. I think when we talk about populist foreign policy, we start to see that actually even in the pre-governmental phase, populist leaders actually bring a lot of issues that I will conceptualize as part of the foreign policy domain, that are mainly international or transnational. Immigration, for example, right? Foreign aid. Even the criticisms in some of the electoral campaigns against the value of the United Nations. And that you didn't see that before. So I think the boundary between the domestic and the international is gone when it comes to populist leaders. So therefore, these leaders see the international as an extension of that domestic political game in many ways, right? But also, foreign policy, in this case, becomes a tool for domestic legitimation of the leader and his project, right? So at the end, populists are constantly in the campaign trail, even when governing, I think, and that also applies to the international. For example, leaders like Jair Bolsonaro use international issues such as climate change or global institutions as a way to reinforce the political project at home. Milei has been with Donald Trump, Elon Musk, he gave him a motosierra, right, once, while also being critical of socialism as an ideology and the role of the state in the economy in the Davos forums. This means that international conflicts and the international more generally are framed in domestic terms, right? Before we see that actually the international was framed in international terms, even though it sounds quite obvious. But now we see that all international conflicts, tensions, and relationships, right, in terms of friends and foes, are more framed in this domestic logic. Also, we see that foreign actors, institutions, multilateral institutions, even bilateral relations sometimes, are incorporated into this elite category, right? The anti-elite part of the populist project. And actually, many issue areas of global governance becomes part of a political battleground. So they are politicized all the time. And one key aspect that I wanted to mention as well is that when we talk about the politicization of foreign policy, or populist foreign policy, we also have to keep in mind that populist leaders will focus on issue areas that are salient, right? So that are likely to attract support from followers, right? From the people, whatever the people is a very stretchy and manipulable category and social abstract category that you can include and exclude who the people is in this project, right? But when we talk about this populist foreign policy and the issues are selected on that kind of, domestic mindset, who can follow this, right? For example, populist leaders are very unlikely to focus and pay attention to topics in foreign policy and global governance that are highly technical. Because they cannot communicate it, because they are too, is that part of the, the experts, right? There is a technical language that cannot be translated into something that will appeal to the audience, right? So that's something that's important to highlight. So, and here, I guess, you will see that, again, the topics that I already mentioned, so the issue areas which will be highly politicizable are immigration, climate change, gender, LGBT rights, human rights, and foreign policy aid, right? So, when we talk about the personalization of foreign policy, right, that's quite clear, right, as a key characteristic, right? Only the leader is the one that kind of incarnates the reivindication of the nation and is able to talk to other leaders or to institutions and say, we are new, we want to reivindicate the status of this country, right? So leave us alone, in a way. And then when we talk about politicization, we also have to talk about mobilization. So if we talk about issue areas that are subject to be politicized, these issue areas are also, you can mobilize people behind these projects, right? So when we talk about mobilization, populist leaders rely on antagonistic narratives, right? The us versus them, right? Or what we call, and many of you might know, the so-called othering, right? So it's the people, it's the us, the political elites at home and abroad are the them, right? So the ones that are excluded from this concept or new vision of the nation, right? So second aspect when it comes to mobilize, how populist leaders mobilize is it's based on emotions. The role of emotions in studying populism is something that has, at least in foreign policy, is becoming more and more strong because there is this kind of bond between the leader and the people that is important to unpack through the role of emotions, right? Now, if the leader is able to manipulate and stretch emotions that are collective, or whether the leader feels that kind of emotions as well, that's a different story that I cannot answer here. But at least there is an emotional appeal. And the other thing is that how you communicate as a populist leader your foreign policy offer or depict the international, it has to be through simplistic, rather simple narratives, but also as well through simple images, right? And images here, what I mean here is that friends, enemies, right? It's very, very kind of, binary in many ways. But these images actually help to structure foreign policy behavior by categorizing actors, right? You name actors in certain categories and social categories, which we will call roles. So we can see these dynamics in some illustrative cases, right? For example, Jair Bolsonaro, when he frames environmental governance as an attack to the sovereignty of the nation, right? It is there, it is the politicization, it is the mobilization, trying to mobilize, but it's also as well an appeal in terms of emotions, that these kind of international actors are constraining our sovereignty, right? We cannot economically grow because of these agencies that tell us to have better environmental standards, right? And impose certain restrictions in how we deal and manage our natural resources. So that is not just economic logic, it has an emotional appeal. So Bolsonaro, for example, withdrew Brazil's name from organizing climate governance conference, framed the Amazonian deforestation questioning as going against the will of the people. And he also withdrew Brazil from a United Nations Pact on immigration, for example, as well, or like the Global Compact for safe and orderly and regular migration. And also, this is also as well something that Donald Trump has done, right? He has recently withdrawn from more than 60 agencies of the United Nations, right? And on others, he has cut the funding as well. So, in the case of Javier Milei, he tended to question global norms and institutions. He withdrew from the World Health Organization, from WHO, right? And the Argentine delegation actually walked away from the COP29 conference, right? So those are actually, you might say, okay, these are just cranky boys that actually walk away, but actually they are meaningful acts in diplomacy. They're meaningful acts when it comes to the international, right? So those things actually produce certain type of predispositions as well, but also as well is a way to politicize, but it's also as well attract followers and sympathizers to this project. The other case is Bukele. He actually, in his narrative, if one pay attention and reads his different speeches, both at home and abroad in the United Nations, you will see that actually he tends to confront, even when he goes to the United Nations General Assembly, he will confront the United Nations, so to speak, to the institution, right? So he will actually first try to reinforce his domestic authority, because he has been questioned for democratic backsliding by eroding, human rights norms and practices and so on. So he actually addresses both the national and the international audiences, but also as well in a way that is always very simplistic, in a way that, is the nation, is the people against this global elite. And I know that I'm sounding repetitive, but it's very simple in many ways, right? So at the same time, when he performs internationally along these lines, he also tries to contain criticisms to his political project, right? So there is a lot of questionings on Bukele with his prison and how he treats, citizens. There is first and second order citizens in many ways. So, but he tries to reivindicate this project by creating a narrative in which it's all about the will of the people, right? So even though that this kind of people versus elite is present all the way in the foreign policy and the way these leaders position themselves in the international, we also have, there is certain nuance, right? So it's not, some of these leaders will emphasize more the anti-elite dimension, right? Others will be more in the international when they are in diplomatic forums, when they are in bilateral relations, when they talk in this joint press conference. Some of them, they will pay more emphasis to the people, and others will be anti-elitist. And actually, that creates different type of foreign policy behaviors at the same time, right? So I can elaborate more on that later during the Q&A. But I would say that in the case of Javier Milei, for example, he gives more emphasis to the anti-elite, right? So all these institutions are full of technocratic people that has imposed and have eroded what Argentina is, right? On the other hand, we will see that actually the narrative in foreign policy of the foreign policy of Bolsonaro would be more emphasis on the people, right? So there are different dynamics there. So if they question this international, they position themselves in the international, then what? I mean, what is it here? What is something that we can learn about this? And I will, in terms of, for example, cooperation, right? Because we can say, for all what I have said here, one might say, okay, they don't want to cooperate. They're anti-international cooperations. And actually, I think they are not. They cooperate all the time, but they just cooperate different than most traditional politicians on the international, right? So what they do that is different vis-a-vis non-populist leaders in the international when it comes to cooperation is that they promote and advance transactional cooperation, like very short-term cooperation, right? So it's very materialistically driven, right? So it's here and now, and it doesn't have a future horizon in terms of how they cooperate. When, we see traditional politicians and diplomats that actually they tend to set pillars for further cooperation. So it doesn't matter that I don't gain much now because I know that in the other interaction I will gain more, right? But they just focus now in a very transactional way. The other is that there is a preference for bilateralism. What I mean here is it is new in a way because they don't prioritize the interactions between states and bureaucrats and diplomats. It is leader to leader. That is the type of bilateral relationships that they have. The third characteristic when it comes to how they cooperate in the international is that they have eroded the value of the United Nations. The most essential institutions in the international have been undermined and eroded by these leaders. But actually, where do they cooperate? They go to informal and low-cost institutions, right? Like the G20, right? The Economic Forum in Davos, for example, that are very informal settings where they are cooperating. So we can add the Shields of the Americas now as well as another type of informal cooperation that doesn't have much institutional substance. And the other thing is that if there is a transactional cooperation, there is also as well selective engagement with certain institutions over others. So just to start, when we talk about multilateralism and cooperation in the international level, we also have to see that this is not just about populist foreign policy. Through this kind of foreign policy action, these leaders actually are not only contesting, they're also transforming the makeup of global governance. So actually, they're offering a new moral horizon in terms of governance, right? I mean, many will talk about that we have been living in a so-called liberal international order where there has been promoted certain key values and norms, right? And this has been guided by the so-called cosmopolitan ideal that has now vanished. So, as we know that these populist leaders actually cooperate in other ways in the international, what they are doing is they are promoting a new moral code, right? That is more nativist, is more conservadorism, and it is more factional as well, right? So they're remaking these kind of, moral codes, right? By offering, for example, new ways to interact in the international. And I will elaborate a bit more on this before I conclude, right? So there is a normative change in terms of, norms and values. The value of the democracy on the international has been eroded, right? We know that. There is many practices and examples for this. Actually, they have created institutional pressure. The withdrawal from different agencies of these actors is actually weakening the pillars of multilateralism. They offer new alternative practices instead, like what I mentioned about the low cost and informal interactions. But also as well, they cooperate through selective alliances, right? Donald Trump, for example, and the same Bolsonaro, they have appraised that leaders that they're authoritarian rather than democratic in many ways, right? So that creates some kind of, alliance dynamics in the international that end eroding the pillars of global governance. And I think the most important, at least for me, because I'm starting to do research on this at the moment, is the marginalization of civil society. What I mean here is that they have pushed aside NGOs and civil society groups, right? Those that promote human rights, climate standards, gender issues. But if they push them aside, they do it through cutting their budget, kicking them out of the country in many ways, right? Restricting their operations in a country. So, but at the same time, actually, we are starting to observe that these populist leaders, at least in the case of Bolsonaro in the past, Milei, and most importantly, I would say Donald Trump, they have started to fund all these new conservative groups, like Christians, family values, that actually are promoting now new ways of, sexual health and family planning that are more traditional, something that they claim that is part of the heartland. So, to conclude, very, very briefly. So, basically, it's very simple. Populist foreign policy is about this kind of, us versus them, but in this case, it's about the people versus the elite, right? And actually is something that takes form in terms of behavior in foreign policy through personalization, politicization, and mobilization. Far-right populists do not reject international cooperation per se. They use it rather strategically to promote their own values and their own vision of the international. And how this happens is to trying to promote a new moral horizon or code, which I call cosmofragmentalism, in which we can see already effects in some key issue areas of global governance. So thank you very much.